Oh, a love letter from Luke. It doesn't have to be Valentine's Day to express your true feelings for the person that you care about. Roses are red, violets are blue. You are fine, and my sister is too. I think I need to break up with him. We are a little bit late with Valentine's Day this year. I got a little overwhelmed considering I had to do my Rise of the Resistance video. You should totally check that out, by the way, because it's pretty awesome. The ride itself is unbelievable, and my love for it was the love I was trying to project out there on Valentine's Day. However, this is a video I've wanted to do for a long time because romance in Star Wars has always been a thing ever since the beginning in the original trilogy. You know, we had Han and Leia, and they became super iconic with their I love you, I know, and everything that follows. And they've obviously continued in the sequel trilogy, and we've had our romances in the prequel trilogy. Whether they be good or not is just, you know.
I'm not afraid to die. I've been dying a little bit each day since you came back into my life.
But we do have some golden content in there. One relationship that I think is one that fans have always scratched their heads about and speculated is the one between Luke Skywalker and Leia Organa.
This is embarrassing. Like seriously. No, seriously.
And no, this is not Game of Thrones. We're not over here advocating for this kind of relationship. However, it is a curious one because there's some clear signs pointing in the direction that this was supposed to originally be the endgame, or that this love triangle was supposed to be different. Because what we kind of end up with at the end of Return of the Jedi is that it happens upon that Leia is Luke's sister. I mean, spoilers if you haven't seen Return of the Jedi, but if you haven't seen Return of the Jedi, why are you watching my channel? Because that is so far away from my spoiler radar that I can't even begin to say. George Lucas likes to promote this idea that he's had the entirety of Star Wars pretty much mapped out from the get-go. Ignoring the concept art and original ideas I flaunted a couple of videos ago, there's another really big piece of this that obviously hinders that statement. That would be the romance. More specifically, the direction the movies take in this regard. Obviously, we end on Han and Leia professing their love to each other in Empire, and things are pretty finalized from there, going into Return of the Jedi with a changed perspective and an outlook on life as a result of being in love with each other. They're so iconic that we, as viewers, can't really imagine it any other way and see them as the definitive Star Wars couple. This was not always the case. One of the main points we need to address is the effect that differing scripts have on what we see reflected in the movies. The biggest point of this going around is currently the debate that fans are having of whether or not Colin Trevorrow's script would have been better than J.J. Abrams on Episode 9. This kind of thing is always up for debate and actually dates way back to even the original trilogy. The way the romance was originally supposed to go ties into this, so hang on for a moment. The original draft of Empire Strikes Back was written by Lee Brackett, who sadly died before she could continue working on the project, and detailed a very different fate for Anakin Skywalker than the one we've come to know. Originally, Anakin was supposed to literally have been killed by Vader, not making this scene in A New Hope from Ben a bold-faced lie.
A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father.
Nor this scene with the Emperor super vague.
I have no doubt this boy is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker.
How is that possible?
Search your feelings, Lord Vader.
Which means that initially, no, Vader was not supposed to be Luke's dad. Even if Vader is literally father in German. In George Lucas's original 9-part space opera, it was always going to be second trilogy, prequel trilogy, final trilogy, in that making order. But his prequel trilogy ideas were going to be about the heroics of Anakin Skywalker and his time as the Last Jedi. And ultimately display his downfall and murder by Darth Vader, who always was going to be a former ally that betrayed them in some ways, or shape, or form. Keep in mind, these are drafts, so there's going to be some level of vagueness here, so we didn't know exactly how this was going to happen, or who Vader was, but to some extent we were going to get that backstory. In Brackett's draft, there was to be a scene on Dagobah where Ben shows up again, a la ghost form. He brings along the dead Anakin Skywalker for the ride, and they have a little chat about the dangers that lie ahead. In that chat, they talk about Nelith, Who's that, you may ask? But Luke's original sister, who was hidden from him to save her from Vader's evil clutches. Because unsurprisingly, Leia was actually never originally supposed to be Luke's sister at all, but a purebred royal Organa, which I guess puts some things into perspective in terms of intention goes. George wasn't satisfied with Brackett's script, though, and did end up discarding it in favor of Lawrence Kasdan's, who would go on to work on several other Star Wars movies later on. However, Brackett did receive a credit for the film despite George opting not to keep most of her proposed content. Nelith, or who would be Nelith, was a late-game proposal in the sense some of the evidence remains in the movie still. The biggest example would be Yoda's iconic...
No, there is another.
Because in the context of canon, Leia being the other that is referred to does not make an ounce of sense in this instance. Why? Because Luke is going off to fight Vader, where Ben and Yoda can't help him, and they know he's going to rescue Leia, who is also in Vader's clutches, where Ben and Yoda can't help her either. Her being the other hope just doesn't add up in the grand scheme of things, because she's in just as much danger as Luke is with her evil father being right there. The other was always supposed to be this hanging plotline that George would one day return to in his sequel trilogy. He'd go forth and prosper with the prequels.
You want to go home and rethink your life?
I want to go home and rethink my life.
And then episodes 7 through 9 would detail Luke training his Jedi Order and being in search for his long-lost sister, where the big reveal would happen in episode 8. It's a little different than the reveal we got in our episode 8.
You have no place in this story. You come from nothing. You're nothing.
It is interesting that originally Leia wasn't supposed to be the only woman in the galaxy. Who'd have thought? But good to know we're still in the business of familial plot twists. Even still, the idea of Leia being Luke's sister instead of this Nelith girl didn't come into play until much later. Like, probably on set of Return of the Jedi later. I say this because if we take a look at the unused footage from this movie, there's a lot of squeamish stuff between Luke and Leia going on. Even after all the stuff that goes down with Han. That's because George initially wanted to establish a very serious love triangle between the three of them, and has never really opened up on who he thought he saw Leia was going to end up with. So Leia loves both of them, but in different ways, the brotherly way and the romantic way. And I think that regardless of Leia being Luke's physical sister, I think this was eventually going to be the route that George took it with. She pretty much teeters back and forth between Luke and Han if you look at the deleted scenes. Hell, even after the big I love you happens, she still has this moment with Luke in a deleted scene.
Stay here.
Leia, what are you doing? Which doesn't make any sense at all. Return of the Jedi is a lot more of a fix-it movie than anyone really gives it credit for, which is apparently the dying duty of Part 3s in these trilogies. The entire reason of Ben's conversation with Luke about a certain point of view was to cover up the fact that, yeah, Vader was never meant to be Luke's father, and the idea hadn't occurred to Lucas until they were physically making Empire Strikes Back. Leia being Luke's sister is another tied loose end, which, when you consider what George was looking at, he had this dangling plot point billowing in the breeze that fans were latching onto with bated breath. He knew in his very soul that the sequel trilogy would not be made for decades, because it was always going to be Old Man Luke in his final act. Which we got. Kind of. And asking people to wait for that long to address it would be criminal in a sense and would likely be painted as a plot hole, even if it was something he'd intended on returning to. To avoid that, and the difficulty of relying on actors to stay alive for 40 years, he opted to tie the original trilogy up with a bow and make Leia his sister. Which of course makes things a little icky with her "I've always known" statement when Luke reveals this to her, because if you squint your eyes and look the other way, you can just pretend she had the difficult choice of kissing the Wookiee or her brother to make Han jealous. And poor Han, he really goes through it in the span of a second.
It's not like that at all. He's my brother.
Us too, Han. Us too. It's interesting because the decision to make Leia Luke's sister stems from this "there is another" statement, and had that not been included as a later point to address, it probably wouldn't have happened at all, and who's to say who Leia would have ended up with. I do think in the name of chemistry, what we've got is what's best.
I love you.
I know.
And of course, a good bit of Leia being Luke's sister stuff is addressed to the best ability in the sequel trilogy that we did get. Because, life is sad, and it does take people away from us too soon. But seeing Luke and his sister, who ended up being Leia, parry and duel with lightsabers for even a few seconds was pretty worthwhile to me. I think that people would have been disappointed if Luke's sister was left that ambiguous, like it would just been like, oh, he has a sister, and then we go off and we do the prequels and then we have to wait. That's something that I think that while it's fine to have things be a mystery and to have there's be all the speculation, I don't think that the EU would have thrived very hard on that, because then it would have been impossible for them to write anything beyond Return of the Jedi, because that's where George Lucas wanted it to go. So that we would have no EU, basically, if he had left this open-ended. And God knows, some of you love your EU content, and I can't begrudge you for that, because some of it is quality, and some of it is not. So what do you guys think? Do you wish that we got this version of what the sequel trilogy was supposed to be like? I know a lot of people have their feelings on what the sequel trilogy and where it would have went. I think that I stand in the position of it would have been a very difficult thing to accomplish, because George would have essentially had to have the mindset of, I really hope all these actors are alive 40 years from now. And yes, most of them are, but in the event of Carrie Fisher and everything, that's a hard thing to structurally plan for on a story level, to conclude. It was way better, I think, for him to conclude the original trilogy the way that he did, even though I have my grievances on Leia's character not being fleshed out as a Skywalker. I have my beef with that. We've gotten our crumbs in this sequel trilogy, so I felt like this honored that as much as possible, because you can't just whip out all of those things, as unfortunately we did have the circumstance of Carrie Fisher passing away. And in this case, I think he was better off actually keeping it tight and tying it up with a bow. Tell your brothers and sisters Happy Valentine's Day. May the Force be with you.
Got me thinking, I might never get the chance.
What? Tell me.